Advanced lightning is found under the Generate category, and if you've ever played around with effects in After Effects, you've probably touched the Advanced Lightning effect. It's just a lot of fun to play with. Now, I'm gonna need something to generate this on top of, and I don't really want it to be a green background, so I'm gonna make a new solid, and I'll call this BG for background. Click OK, and black is fine for now. I'll duplicate this and call this lightning, and then double click on the advanced lightning to apply the effect. Immediately we get a lightning bolt. It has a glow. It looks pretty realistic, but how can we customize the effect? Well, let's take a look at the controls. First of all, we have the lightning type, which we're gonna look at all these options. We'll stick with direction for now, but what this is going to do is have two control points. The origin point, which is this one right here, and then the direction. And this is going to be the direction that the lightning bolt is actually striking in. So it's not going to end at this point, it's just gonna move in the same direction as that point. So I'll just have this go pretty much straight down, and then we'll look at the next option, which is conductivity state. And this is basically an easy way to animate the bolt. If you're thinking of this more like electricity that's being conducted and something that you're seeing for much longer lengths of time than a lightning bolt, then just animating this conductivity state is going to give it this random movement. And a really easy way to animate this is just by using a simple expression, Alt Option, click on that stopwatch, and just type in time, and then click off. And now this value is going to be driven by the time of the comp. So as I play forward, that property animates based on time. And if you wanted to go faster, you could multiply it by say 10, and now it's going to be much more chaotic, but that's a really easy way to get quick animation of this effect. Now, if you're doing a lightning bolt, you're probably not going to want to do that. Just spend a little bit of time on YouTube and look up lightning bolt strikes, and you'll see that they pretty much hold their shape and instead grow from one point to whatever it strikes. And we can animate that very easily as well, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Next up is the core settings. So let's jump in there and look at the three options we have. Core radius, so if I zoom in on the lightning bolt, this is the white part, the center core part of our lightning. If I turn it up, it gets thicker and wider. The core opacity makes it more or less opaque. And then the core color determines what color the lightning actually is. So I could make it a green or a yellow, anything I want. And you see that that's blending in with the glow. It's not just giving me a filled core of whatever color I pick. It's actually doing some blending to make this look really hot. All right, I'm gonna leave that at white for now, and that's it for core settings. Next up is glow settings, and this is what's going to control that outer, softer glow around the core. So glow radius, that'll control how big or how far away that glow shows up. We've got glow opacity to make it more or less intense, and glow color. So if I change this again to say a hot pink, and then I changed my core to something completely different, maybe a green color, you can see that those colors are now blending together, and it's a very interesting, unique looking lightning now. So the core color is basically underneath the glow color, and the glow blends on top, and it looks to me like it's using an add blend mode. All right, let's get back to white and blue and collapse those two up. Next up is alpha obstacle, and this is a very interesting part of this effect. It basically allows you to choose an area that the lightning can't pass through. And we can do this with either the alpha of the layer we've applied it to, or by drawing a mask on top of the layer. Since this is just a solid, there's no alpha to it, it's just 100% solid pixels. But if I just grabbed, say, my ellipse tool, clicked and drag while holding shift to make a perfect circle and let go, nothing happens. But if I turn alpha obstacle up high enough, eventually the lightning doesn't pass through it. So I can move these points around, and now you see that it's kind of hitting that mask and moving around it. So if you wanted to have electricity moving around an object, this is exactly how you would do it. And let me show you that if I bring out my logo and apply advanced lightning to it, I'll turn off the second instance for a second and turn up alpha obstacle high enough, then it is going to start hitting my logo. Now I can't really see it because it's applying this effect on top of my logo, replacing the contents. But if I just add a CC composite effect right after it and uncheck RGB only, I'll change composite original to behind. And now the lightning is interacting with that alpha channel. So again, it's gonna find the contours using that alpha and wrap around, bounce through, and generally not pass through that alpha channel. But adjusting the alpha obstacle value is what will determine how strong that lightning actually is and how it can move through your layer. All right, let me get rid of that. We'll go back to our original instance, and I'll get rid of that mask and turn the alpha obstacle back down to 0. Next up is turbulence. So let's actually just reset this whole thing so it's back to its very defaults. And I'll zoom into somewhere around here where we can see a lot of detail on that bolt. If I turn up the turbulence, it's going to increase the amount of detail basically in that lightning bolt. So it's now much more random. It's moving back and forth a lot more. And if I turn the turbulence way down, then it's going to get much more straight all the way down to a value of 0, and it will just now be a beam going between these 2 points. And now we basically are just using this like the beam effect, which isn't all that exciting. So I'm going to turn that turbulence back up. Actually, I'll just reset it back to its default. And the next property is forking. So this is the probability of the main core to split off into other strands. So if I turn the forking all the way down, then we're not going to have any secondary strands at all. But as soon as I increase that a bit, then it will have more and more forking coming off of the main core. So you can get something that looks really powerful and has lots of energy, or you can turn it way down and just have a single bolt, or maybe just a little bit of forking so that it spreads out just a bit. I'll reset that back to its default, and the next property is Decay. If I turn that value up, you can see that it brings back those forked bolts. It's not doing anything to the main core, it's just basically trimming off the forked parts of the lightning so that they are more or less intense. So if I turn this all the way down to 0, then the forking will not stop. They'll never get cut off, and we have way more electricity now. But if you just increase that a little bit, it'll back it off, and you can trim that off as much as you want. Now, the next property is Decay main core, and if I check that, then it also will include that main core with the decay. So this is one way that you could animate the bolt coming on if you wanted to do it all at once. I'm going to uncheck that checkbox and reset the decay. And next up is composite on original. If I check that on, then it's going to appear back on top of the solid, which actually would have been a much simpler way of handling my logo. Again, if I add that advanced lightning, instead of using CC composite, I could have just checked on composite on original, and then alpha obstacle would have worked just fine. So there you go. All right, get rid of my logo. We don't need to check that on for this black solid, but you do see how that blends differently. So be aware of that. And then let's dive into the expert settings. There are a lot of controls here, but they're really not that difficult to understand. You don't have to be an expert. So first up is complexity. If I turn this all the way down to 1, obviously we get much less detail. This is kind of like turbulence, but even with complexity at 1, I could increase the turbulence and give more zigzagging basically to that bolt. The default value was 6, but I could increase this higher and higher all the way up to 10, and you can see that there's just way more detail now in that bolt. All right, let's put that back down to 6. Next up is minimum fork distance, and this is basically how far away one fork has to be from the next. So the higher the number, the more spread out the forking is going to be along the lightning. And the lower the number, the closer together those forked off sections will be. So the default value is 64. If you wanted a little bit more, you just back that off a bit. Next up is termination threshold, and this actually works with the alpha obstacle. So again, if I just draw in a random path here and I set the alpha obstacle up to a certain value, and let's not have this path twist, decreasing the termination threshold is basically a threshold for where that gets cut off. How thick the alpha obstacle has to be for it to not pass through or around. So if I use this path and make a really skinny point and just kind of move this over the side, the termination threshold is going to determine whether or not this can travel around that alpha obstacle or how much it's able to travel around it. The higher the threshold, the more it's going to be able to travel. The lower it is, the less it will be able to move around it. This is all dependent on the angle, the type of alpha channel that you have, and is even influenced by the turbulence and complexity properties. So you can play around with those to get something very precise. And if you check on main core collision, then it's going to apply that termination threshold and the alpha obstacle only to the main core. The forking is no longer influenced by that alpha obstacle. All right, I'm going to uncheck that. And next up is fractal type. It's set to linear, and this is just how it's determining the shape of the actual lightning. So fractal is set to linear. We could change it to semi-linear, and it's going to have a little bit different of a look. Let me get rid of this mask for a second. So this is semi-linear, and this is linear. And then we also have spline, and this will be much less complex. So you might increase the complexity up a little bit to maybe 7 or 8, and it just has a different shape for that lightning. I'm going to set that back to linear, set my complexity back to 6. And next up is core drain. And if I move this to be pointed straight down again, what it's going to do is basically determine how far that core lasts depending on how many forks there are in the bolt. So if I increase the core drain all the way up to 100%, then the main core is only going to last as long as that first fork. If I back it up a little bit, it will last longer and longer, but get more and more drained as those forks happen. So if I turn the minimum fork distance up, then we're gonna get more of that core, even though the core drain is turned up. Or if I undo that and I increase the amount of forking, then we're going to get less and less of that core with the core drain up. I'm gonna set that back down to 0. Next is fork strength. And this is basically a percentage of the core value. So if core drain was increased a little bit, the forks are getting drained as the core is getting drained as well. So where the core is 100%, the forks are 70%. Or if I turn this down, they'll become less and less visible. And then finally, we have fork variation. If I turn that all the way down, they'll be very uniform. But if I turn it way up, then we're gonna have lots of variation between all of those forks. And those are all of the main controls for advanced lightning, but now let's look at the different lightning types. So I'm gonna reset this again back to its default and change this from direction to strike. The main difference between these two types is that strike is going to connect the origin and direction points. So the lightning ends at that direction point. So this is where you could very easily set up the effect to hit one point. If you wanted to animate the strike from the start to the end, you could use, say, the decay property and just make sure to decay main core. Change this all the way up to a high value so that you can't really see it, and set a keyframe on that property. Then go forward maybe 2 or 3 frames, turn that way down low, probably not all the way to 0 because you don't want that much, but just enough for it to connect. And then depending on what look you're going for, you might want to just turn it off at that point. So with that layer selected, I'll press Alt and the right square bracket, and that will trim my layer. And then if I play this back, it's just a very quick strike and turns off. Now that might have been a little too quick, and maybe I want to combine this decay property with maybe the core drain. So if I go into the expert settings, set a keyframe on core drain, and then go forward a few frames and turn it all the way up, then it'll have a little bit more motion to it. And maybe that's still a little too fast, but I really want to encourage you, if you're trying to make accurate lightning or electricity, that you look up reference footage on YouTube. It's not hard to find. And if you go frame by frame, you can really see how this moves to get something that looks a lot more realistic. Okay, I'm gonna get rid of that trimmed part of my layer and take those keyframes off. And why don't we just reset it again and go to the next lightning type, which is braking. Doesn't look all that different from direction, but its main difference is its relationship between the origin and direction points. So if I bring the direction closer and closer, you'll see that the forks that are coming off of the main core are branching out perpendicular to the core more and more. So the further away they are, the more they're going to travel towards that direction. And the closer these 2 points are, the more those branches are going to basically bend backwards or outwards, branching outwards from that main core. So with the 2 points this close together, if I change it from braking back to direction, you see that they're all just pointed in that same direction. And that can be extremely useful for making this type of electricity. Next up is bouncy. And this one is really crazy. If I move the direction around, it's not really changing much about the look of the lightning other than just the initial state. And moving this origin point around also has a pretty drastic effect on the entire shape of that lightning. So I might want to go into the turbulence and turn that down a bit. As I get into smaller numbers, it will be less and less intense, but you can kind of see that it's really kind of wrapping it around and around. And the higher this number, the more that's going to turn into kind of like a ball of energy and not so much a striking bolt of energy. So I can roughly place this around the screen, but it's really going to ball up a lot. And maybe I want to turn the forking down a bit, maybe turn the minimum fork distance up, and maybe turn the complexity down even just a little bit. And even just going from 6 to 5 really makes a huge difference. So this is something that you're going to have to dial in and find out what works for you. Let's reset the effect, and the next type is Omni. So I'll click on that, and you'll notice that that is actually a divider between these first 4 and the second 4. And when I go to one of these 4, it's going to change direction to outer radius, and that's the distinguishing factor between these two. So if I place my origin, say right in the middle, and then I move my outer radius, this is a hard cutoff basically for how far this lightning is allowed to travel. So if I set the cutoff to be right about there, I can mess with all the other settings to make this more or less intense. And changing the origin point is kind of going to change how that lightning actually is spreading out from that point. Next up is Anywhere, and the difference between Omni and Anywhere is very similar to the difference between direction and braking. where those forked out branches are now traveling kind of perpendicular to the main core. It's not influenced by how far away the outer radius is, but that's kind of the difference between those forks going towards the direction of the core or anywhere off of that core. Next up is vertical, and this is going to be straight down. We don't even have the direction or outer radius control anymore. It's a single point and it's just gonna go straight down. And then finally, we have two-way strike. So what this is going to allow us to do is have 2 points that shoot out towards each other. So strike looks like this, and two-way strike basically doubles the amount of lightning. If I turn up the core drain, it's going to drain out in both directions. So if you wanted to animate a spark that was being connected between 2 points, this is definitely a way that you could do that. And with that, we've looked at all the different lightning types. There's obviously a ton of different applications of how you can use this. I'm going to quickly show you how you might make one of those plasma balls using this effect. So on the background, I'm going to add a ramp effect. So we'll start there and make this a radial ramp. I'll put the 1 point about there and the second point outwards. We'll change the start color to be maybe a really dark saturated blue and the end color to be a dark saturated purple color, something like that. Click OK, and maybe I'll swap those colors. Yeah, I like that better. And if you're not familiar, this is what I'm talking about when I say plasma ball. It's one of these toy orbs basically that you can touch and the plasma goes towards your fingers. And I just want to make something that looks similar to this. So I think for the lightning type, I'm going to change this to maybe anywhere and move that outer radius so that it automatically has that circular cutoff built in for my orb. And why don't I just make a circle really quickly? And this will serve as kind of the glass. So I'll say maybe 800 by 800. I don't want this to have a fill. I just want a stroke, and we'll make it a little bit thicker. And really this is just going to serve as a guide for now, but I'll call this sphere and lock that as well as the background. And I want my outer radius to end right there. So it looks like that energy is being contained within it. I want to go to the core settings and make it a little bit bigger so that it looks more like that. Core opacity, I think you can back it off a little bit. It doesn't need to be quite as intense. And the core color, I'm going to tinge this just a little bit into the kind of bright blue cyanish color. Something like that looks nice. And then I'll go into the glow settings, and that could probably be dialed back a little bit as well. And why don't I add in some pink to this? Not a ton, but just something maybe like that. Maybe turn that radius down even a little bit further. And that core opacity might be a little too low. So I'm going to turn that back up and then make this a little bit more red. There we go. We get this nice mix of pinkish purple. Now the actual forking is way too complex. So I'm going to go to my turbulence and turn this down. I don't want it to have nearly as much detail. I might even need to go to my complexity and drop it down. And I actually want to change the fractal type to spline so that this is a little bit more smooth and not so jagged. And then I can play around with this turbulence, maybe turn it up a little bit more so I get a bit of forking there. And then maybe turn the minimum fork distance down a little bit so we get some more of that coming off. And turn up the forking a little bit. And that's a little too crazy. So maybe that fork distance is a little too low, but maybe something like that. All right, so I like that. The conductivity state is going to be my friend here for animating this very simply. So I'm just going to add that time expression. I'll say time and see how that animates, how quickly it goes. And I'm actually pretty happy with that. So I'm going to leave that as it is, but I'm going to want to have multiple instances of this effect. So I'm going to actually add in one more part to my expression and just say times index. And that's going to take the layer number or the index value and multiply it by the time value. And that will give me a random number for every instance. If I duplicate this effect, now I have 2 unique copies of it. I can duplicate it again and just get something really wild and crazy. Now, I want to be able to edit all of the properties to control the forking and everything from one single copy of this effect and have it go through the others. So I'm actually going to delete that third copy and modify my expressions just a bit. First, I'm going to select Advanced Lightning, go to Edit, Copy with Property Links, and this will copy everything with expressions and then paste on top of that second copy. Now all of my numbers are red. That means all of these properties are linked to the original, and I just need to modify that conductivity state so it's not 100% identical. So let me go into that conductivity state by double clicking on it, open up the expression for it and edit, and this is where I'm just going to type in again, time times index. click off, and now it will be slightly different. Now I can make a few more copies of this. So let's say 4 different copies, maybe 5, and I have lots of different lightning going off now, but I can go into the original and modify the controls of just this one instance, and everything else will update. So if I move this in and out, now they're all going to move in and out. So let's say about there, I'll turn the turbulence down, and this is going to affect all of the instances. So I could turn that down. I could also turn down the fork strength so that those don't show up quite as much. Maybe turn up the core drain just a little bit, increase the core overall radius, and really dial this into something that I like. Now, if I play this back, we're going to get all of these lightning strikes moving all around the orb, and maybe I'll add in just a couple more of them. And I think that looks pretty good. Now I can make this look a little bit more spherical if I pre-compose all of these lightning layers. So I'll just select all of them, press Control Shift C, and then name this Plasma. Click OK, and now I can add some other effects on top of this. And I think I'm going to add a lens effect. If I go to CC Lens, this will give me some distortion that's really spherical around the edges there and just give me something really unique. Maybe turn the convergence back just a little bit. But this way we've got lines traveling all around this ball. I mean, it's definitely abstract. It's not 100% accurate to what this would actually look like, but it does have a pretty cool look. Now I want to make this look like it's glowing a little bit more intensely. So I'm going to duplicate the layer and I'll turn this to the blend mode of add. That makes it much more intense. So I'll call this glow 1 and then add a fast box blur right after that. Increase the blur radius just a little bit. Not a ton, but that softens it out a lot. Duplicate that layer and blur it out a lot further. And then press T with both of those layers selected and just dial back the opacity to make that a little bit less intense. So this is before and after. And I'm gonna make this one more duplicate and just really make this glow out really far, and maybe even turn up the opacity of that one just a little bit. Now, if I play this back, I have some very bright looking electricity happening through my plasma ball. And maybe I want to put something like some distortion in the center here that looks like a core that all this electricity is coming off of. So I'm just going to make a new adjustment layer and I'll call this core distortion, and we will put a bulge effect. So I'm just going to type out bulge and apply that effect right in the middle. I'll make this a little bit larger, and then let's just round this off to maybe 70 by 70. I don't want it too big. And then change that bulge height to be really extreme. I could actually go in either direction to get a different look, but I like the distortion that I get when I push this out pretty far. So I'm going to move it to right about there, turn my anti-aliasing quality up to high, and then just play this back so you can see that this now kind of has an orb in the center that's nice and distorted. And then maybe I'll make that core even just a little bit brighter by just double clicking on the circle tool, and I'll call this core. I'll make it really small, double tap the U key and just type in maybe 80 by 80. I could even drag that below the core distortion and make it a nice hot pink color. So the core is really bright. Change the blend mode to maybe add, and then even add a fast box blur effect to it to just feather out the edges a little bit. Doesn't have to be a whole lot, just something to give a little bit of glow, and maybe make that a little bit smaller. So drag that in, and then maybe turn that fast box blur down. Now we've got this hot core to the entire energy. Now I want to make this outline that we have, this sphere layer, actually look like kind of a rim light around the outside edge. So I'm actually going to get rid of the stroke. I don't need it anymore, and I'll put a fill on that's just white. And I want to cut out a hole in the center of this basically. So I'm just going to first name this glass rim and then duplicate this and call this matte. Scale it down just a little bit and set this as an alpha inverted matte so that it's punching a hole in that glass rim layer, and then add a fast box blur to it to just feather that out. And now I can very precisely just dial this into exactly the look I want. And then I'll change the glass rim layer to the add blend mode so it makes these brighter parts brighter, and maybe turn the opacity overall down just a little bit. And maybe I'll even change the color of this to match the energy and give it a little bit more of a flare. Maybe it could be a cool blue color. Click OK. I like that. And now I can add a little bit of reflection to the entire thing. If I go into my project, I have this HDRI environment map from HDRI Haven, which I'll just apply a CC sphere effect to, and then change this to render the inside rather than the outside, increase the radius, go into my lighting and turn the light intensity all the way down, go into the shading, turn the ambient up to 100 and all the others down to 0. So there is no lighting or shading being applied to this environment. I can go into the rotation and change the rotation Y and just find a point that has some nice bright spots to it and change this layers blend mode to add as well. That will get rid of all the dark areas. And to make this even a little bit more dramatic, I'm going to add a curves effect right before CC sphere, crush out all those dark areas and just leave behind these brighter parts. And again, I can rotate this around until I'm happy with the way that it looks. And it looks like I need to scale that down just a little bit. So I'm going to turn the radius down. And maybe that's a little too intense, so I'm going to bring the opacity of it down as well. But now we have a little bit of a reflection of the environment that just adds a little bit more realism to this glass look. And I could even cut this off a little bit if I add a new solid, layer new solid, and I'll name this matte. And we'll just add a circle. I'm going to hold Control and Shift to scale from the center as a perfect circle. And then press F to bring up the feather of that mask and feather it out a little bit and set that environment map to use the matte as an alpha inverted matte. And now it's going to feather out that reflection much more nicely. So I can mess with the feather amount to get it to look exactly the way that I want. But I'm pretty happy with that. Let's play it back and see what it looks like. Pretty cool. Not entirely accurate, but it definitely gives a very interesting look. And hopefully this gets your creative wheels turning and you want to start messing around with this effect, seeing what you can do with it. It's one of the most fun effects in After Effects. Honestly, there's no shame in just messing around with it and really abusing what you can do with it. But that's all you need to know about advanced lighting. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, then check out the other ones here on my YouTube channel. And if you like my teaching style, then definitely check out my longer form content on Skillshare and School of Motion. And if you want to support more tutorials like this one, check out my Patreon. You can find links for all of that stuff in the description of this video.